The letter came folded inside a biscuit tin, wrapped in oilcloth, the corners stiff with dust. It had traveled from Kansas City through 3 rail lines and 2 mail wagons before a boy with 1 boot and a milk tooth missing left it on the porch rail. Thomas Mercer found it before dawn. The sky was barely more than ash, and the frost on the ground made the boards whisper beneath his boots. He didn't open it right away. He made coffee first, poured it black into a tin cup, and stood at the threshold of his cabin, the weight of the envelope in his hand like something alive. It had been a long time since he'd received anything but wind and silence. When he did open it, the paper cracked like bark. The ink had bled in one corner, but the message was clear. Your request has been processed. A suitable match has been found. Arrival expected 3rd week of April. There were lines below about compensation and commitment, but Thomas didn't read those. He folded the page back with a slowness bordering on reverence, then set it beside the stove where the fire had died to coals. Outside, the snow had melted into glassy crusts, and the ridge across the field looked like a grave too wide for one man. He ran a hand down the back of his neck. He hadn't meant for it to come to this. But the winters were getting meaner and the nights longer, and something in him, something tender and desperate, had outlived his pride. He didn't ask for beauty, didn't ask for sweetness, only for someone with strong hands who wouldn't flinch at the work, someone who could stay quiet when the wind rose. He poured the rest of the coffee into the firebox and watched the steam rise. Come spring, a woman would arrive, and the silence would have to learn her name. The coach arrived in Ash Bluff later than it should have, wheels whining like something old and tired. By the time the dust settled, the town had already begun folding into itself. Storefronts shuttered, smoke thinning above the chimneys. The last sun hung low, brushing the ridge in copper, and the stage groaned once more before falling still. She stepped down without assistance. No parasol, no gloves, just a satchel slung over one shoulder and a pair of worn boots hitting the earth like she meant to stay. Her name was Ada Byrne, and she didn't look back at the driver, or the coach, or the place she'd left behind. Thomas Mercer stood near the edge of the livery, shoulders squared, hands deep in the pockets of his coat. He had expected someone softer, maybe, meeker, but what he saw was bone and purpose, a jaw tight with resolve, and eyes that didn't wander, they measured. "Ada?" he asked. She nodded once. "You're Thomas." It wasn't a question. Her voice was dry, low, carrying dust in the vowels, like she'd swallowed too many miles to bother with pleasantries. He tipped his hat, unsure whether it mattered. "I brought the wagon." "I see it." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that simply existed when nothing needed saying. She climbed aboard without help, adjusted her coat, and settled beside a crate of oats like it was a pew. The road home was rutted and mean. Snow clung to the edges, and the last of the autumn wind still curled through the canyons, dragging leaves that crackled like dry bones. Thomas glanced sideways once. Ada's hands were steady in her lap. Her profile caught the sinking light with the severity of a carving. "You traveled far?" he asked. She didn't answer. Not out of rudeness, just didn't see the need. The cabin came into view an hour later. Sloped roof, smoke from the chimney, goat fence crooked at one end. Ada didn't comment. She stepped down, scanned the homestead like she was checking for something hidden. Then she nodded, more to herself than him. Inside, she walked the perimeter of the room once, touched the edge of the stove, looked at the rafters, folded her coat across a chair, and set the satchel on the floor. She didn't ask which room was hers. just found it. They didn't talk much that night. He made stew. She peeled carrots without being told. The air between them was thick, but not hostile, more like the hush of a church when no one's praying. Later, as Thomas sat whittling near the hearth, he noticed her standing in the doorway, her hair undone, sleeves rolled. She looked like a woman who'd weathered worse than men. When their eyes met, she didn't blink. "I'm not here to be saved," she said. He nodded. "I'm not trying to." She returned to her room without a sound, and he sat there long after the fire dipped low, wondering what kind of grace could survive a voice like hers, and whether he might come to deserve it. The snow came that week, not heavy, just enough to change the sound of things. Hooves no longer cracked on frozen ground. Doors closed with a hush. Even the goats seemed quieter, as if the air itself was listening. Ada rose early and without announcement. She had already fed the animals by the time Thomas stepped out, the cold biting through his sleeves. He found her by the fence, sleeves rolled, wrists raw from the wind, hammering a loose board back into place. He opened his mouth to offer help. She handed him another nail without looking. That was how most days went. They worked in tandem, wordless but not distant. He mended the roof. She boiled linens. He hauled water. She scrubbed the floor with lye that burned her hands pink. Once he found her in the barn, knelt beside a broken crate, sanding the splinters smooth, like the crate had done her harm. The fence didn't sit straight. The ground had shifted underneath during the thaw, leaving one post bowed like a rib set wrong. "He pointed it out once," she said flatly. "It's holding, isn't it?" He didn't reply, and they didn't fix it. That crooked post stayed. A small tilt between them, visible, enduring. She hummed sometimes. Low, tuneless, not quite music. Not cheerful either, more like a person reminding herself she was still breathing. Thomas watched her from the porch more than he admitted. He told himself it was caution, habit. But the truth clung tighter. She moved like someone who'd forgotten how to rest. When she sat, it was always near the stove, not close to it, like she knew warmth could disappear and didn't want to get used to it. She stitched by lamplight, repaired her own boots with coarse thread. Once she mended his coat without asking. He saw it hanging the next morning, patched at the elbow. Nothing said, no gesture made. He didn't thank her, didn't know how. That night, the wind scraped the glass with icy fingernails. He heard her shift in the spare room, the creak of bed slats, the soft sound of breathing grown uneven. He stayed by the fire, poking at embers, pretending not to notice. But when he rose at dawn, her scarf was gone from its hook. She was standing by the creek, barefoot. Water ran cold and sharp around her ankles, her skirt heavy with damp. Her face was turned toward the trees. Her breath came out in little clouds that never rose far. When she spoke, it was like speaking into smoke. Sometimes I need to remember things still move, even if I don't. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. He said nothing, just stepped forward and set her boots beside her on the rock. Their hands touched for half a second. She drew back, then added too quickly, "It's not weakness. I'm not like those women who fall apart." He didn't answer. But when she stepped into her boots and turned to go, she didn't look smaller, just less guarded. And that changed something. The silence after that wasn't the same. It wasn't thick, it was tuned, like something had found its pitch between them. By the end of the week, he was leaving 2 cups on the table at night. She didn't drink from both, but she didn't move the second one either. And that, somehow, was enough. March came with no intention of gentleness. The cold bit less, but the wind sharpened. The snow that had blanketed the hills began to pull away in stringy clumps, revealing the gray bones of the land underneath: mud, root, stone. Ada moved with more ease now. Not comfort exactly, just rhythm. Her body knew where each bucket sat, which floorboard groaned, where the knife belonged after dusk. She no longer asked, she remembered. Thomas found her humming again, this time with her hands deep in soap and ash. The tune had shape now, still not happy, but steadier. He leaned into the doorway, silent. She didn't turn. You always stand there? Sometimes, he said. You notice every time? Ada shrugged. Her hair had come loose from the knot and lay against her neck in soft, damp waves. Her sleeves were rolled past the elbow, revealing wrists traced with faint lines. Not from cold. Not recent. She turned back to the basin. You watch like you're waiting for something to go wrong. He didn't answer right away. Maybe I am. She gave a dry little laugh, closer to breath than sound. Then you won't be disappointed. That evening he brought in extra wood. She set the table without being asked. They moved around each other like 2 animals made wary by kindness. When the fire crackled full, she sought across from him and pulled a thread through the hem of one of his old shirts. The fabric was worn thin, near translucent in places. Her stitches were careful, not quick, but sure. He cleared his throat. You sew like you were taught by someone who didn't trust loose ends. Ada didn't look up. She didn't. My sister used to say, sorrow leaks through bad seams. The fire snapped. A log fell. I never sewed a thing worth keeping, he said. That doesn't mean it didn't hold something. He didn't answer, and she didn't press. Her needle moved. The clock ticked. Later that night, the wind picked up again. This time it howled, not like a cry, but like a warning. Thomas woke to it, listened to it scrape the windows, circle the corners of the house like it was looking for a crack to come through. He rose, added wood to the fire, found her already sitting near it, knees tucked under her, arms crossed. You sleep? He asked. Ada shook her head. Storms, remember where you've been. She didn't explain, but her voice faltered slightly on the last word, and that told more than she meant to. He handed her a blanket, sat down beside her, close this time. The fire pulsed against their knees. Her hands stayed folded, but after a while, one finger loosened and brushed the wool near his leg. Not touching him, just there. He said quietly, I used to think silence meant safety, but now it feels like waiting. She didn't reply, but her shoulder tipped half an inch in his direction. When he woke again, she had fallen asleep on the rug, her hand curled near the hearth, palm open. And that was the first night he thought, without fear, about what it might mean for someone like her to stay. Not because she was owed shelter, but because something about the house felt straighter with her inside it. And the fire! It sounded fuller when she slept beside it. The storm came sudden, the way bad memories do. No warning, just a crack of cold wind through the slats and the smell of steel in the air. Clouds pressed low over Ash Bluff, thick as wool, and by late afternoon the sky had gone the color of wet slate. Thomas had just latched the barn when the first roll of thunder pushed through the hills. The goats were already huddled, eyes white with instinct. He moved quickly, pulling the shutters closed, jamming rags in the cracks beneath the doors. Inside, Ada was lighting the lamps one by one, her face calm, but her hands clenched tighter than the matchsticks needed. "You ever see storms like this?" he asked. She didn't look up. Worse. But not lately. The way she said it left no space for more questions. By nightfall, the house groaned. The wind screamed in the chimney. A tree branch clawed at the roof like it remembered something it wanted to say. They sat by the fire with blankets drawn to their chins. Ada didn't sew that night. She just stared into the flame as if trying to see something inside it. At one point, the thunder cracked so sharp the oil lamp jumped. Ada flinched. Not visibly, but inward. Thomas saw it in the way her jaw set, in the way her breath paused. He didn't ask again, just rose and brought her the second blanket from his bed. She didn't thank him, just wrapped it tighter and let her eyes close, but her back stayed straight, like rest was something she hadn't earned yet. The storm lasted into morning. He returned to find Ada already mopping the floor near the window where the rain had found a way in. Her hair was braided tight, boots laced. She hadn't slept. He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "Storm didn't take you." Ada looked up at him slowly. Her face was pale, but her voice steady. "It tried once, long ago." Thomas didn't move. Let her keep going if she chose. She did. There was a man, before. He didn't hit like a fist. He hit like weather. You didn't see it coming, but you learned to board up quick. She wrung out the cloth in the bucket, hands red and raw. "I left during a blizzard, rode with a mule and a cracked rib. The cold nearly took me, but not before I got past the border. That storm was quieter than him." The room was still. The fire had gone low. Thomas stepped forward and set another log on it. "You don't owe me any of that." Adam met his eyes. "I know. That's why I said it." That night, when the fire burned warm again and the wind was just a whisper against the eaves, they sat on the floor between the stove and the window. Close, not touching. And Thomas thought, for the first time without shame, that he wanted to know how she looked in quiet, not just in pain. He didn't say it, but he stayed there longer than he needed to. And she didn't ask him to move. Spring came late, as if uncertain it was welcome. The ground softened in slow breaths, first along the edge of the creek, then beneath the goat pens, and finally, like a slow apology, in the rows Ada had marked by hand. Her fingers were often caked with soil, her nails short and rimmed in brown. But her shoulders carried less tension now. She moved with the memory of pain, not its presence. Thomas watched from the porch one afternoon as she knelt to plant beets. The sky above her was the color of old parchment. Her braid had come undone halfway, a dark rope unspooling down her back. She didn't notice, or didn't mind. He stepped down with a bucket of water, didn't speak, just set it beside her and waited. Ada dipped her hands in without thanks, rubbed the dirt from her palms, then looked up. "You ever bury something that wasn't dead?" He blinked. "I suppose I have." She nodded. "Me too. Just wondering if it stays down." They didn't speak again until supper. That night, Ada opened the ledger. She had started tracking their supplies in neat columns. Ink on paper. Truth against time. Thomas noticed the way her handwriting had changed. Less rigid. Still tidy, but human. Like she'd stopped writing for someone else's approval. He brought her tea while she worked. Left it without comment. When she looked up, he was already across the room, carving something small from a piece of red cedar. "You always work with your hands?" Thomas shrugged. Doesn't mean I know what I'm doing. Still means something. Later, by the fire, they sat close enough for warmth, but not quite touching. Ada set down the ledger and leaned back against the wall, the flicker of flame catching the edges of her face in gold and shadow. I used to think strength was not needing anyone, she said quietly. Thomas didn't answer. He waited. But maybe it's carrying the things no one sees and still choosing to stay kind. He thought of the woodpile, of how she folded every scarf the same way, of how she always left his coffee cup a little closer to the stove. You carry more than most, he said. She looked over at him then, not sharply, just fully. And you make room for it. The silence that followed didn't sting. It settled, and somewhere between her words and his breath, something old and unspoken stopped trying to be hidden. It just was. The man came at dawn. Thomas was stacking firewood when he saw the rider break the ridge, silhouetted in the early haze. Tall in the saddle, rifle across his back, boots too polished for a settler. The horse trembled with spent strength. Ada had been shelling beans on the porch. When she saw him, her hands paused mid-motion, then resumed, slower. She didn't speak, just rose and walked inside, leaving the bull behind. The rider dismounted without tying off, knocked once on the beam, then stood waiting as if the house owed him something. Thomas didn't move, only watched. She came back out a moment later, sleeves rolled, jaw locked. The man looked her over, smile barely a suggestion. He said something low. Thomas couldn't hear, but he saw her shoulders harden. Whatever words passed between them, they came like echoes through glass, distant, dangerous, already finished. The man didn't stay long, turned back toward his horse, mounted with the grace of someone too used to riding away. He didn't glance back. When the dust settled, Ada stood alone on the steps. Her hands were fists. That evening, she scrubbed her arms raw at the basin. Thomas brought in water. She didn't look up. He was mine once, she said finally. A husband in name. Cruel long before the war gave him license. Thomas stood by the door. You ran. I did. She rinsed her hands. The water pinked. He said no one would take me after him, that I was ruined. She looked over her shoulder. You believe people stay what someone else calls them? Thomas shook his head. Only if they answer to it. She didn't smile, but something in her jaw softened. That night, when they washed dishes, she stood beside him. Not behind, not apart. And when their elbows brushed, neither of them moved. By early July, the orchard had begun to bear. Not much, just a few squat plums and a scatter of sour apples clinging to the branches like survivors, but they were enough. Ada brought them in by the hem of her apron, laying them gently on the table as though they remembered the cold. Thomas carved hooks for drying. She boiled what she could into jars. The cabin smelled of vinegar and fruit skin, of sugar scraped thin across effort. At night, the windows fogged with the weight of heat, the slow boiling of memory. One afternoon, he found her kneeling in the dust near the eastern tree. Not weeding, not harvesting, just there, her palms pressed into the soil, fingers splayed, like she was trying to listen to something buried. He didn't speak. Her hair had come loose from its tie. Dirt clung to her skirt. When she looked up, her eyes didn't startle. Her hands were stained. Her face was tired in a different way, like grief remembered itself inside her bones. There's something buried here, she said. He waited. Not a body, she added, just a box, small, rusted. She didn't ask if she should dig, she already had. A cedar tin, barely wider than 2 hands. Hinges half gone, a patina of time curling along the seam. Inside, a child's bonnet, folded flat with reverence. A name carved into the lid, worn thin by years, barely legible now. Thomas sat beside her in the dirt. The wind had died. Even the insects stilled. Ada touched the bonnet once, lightly, as if afraid it would vanish. I thought it might be a keepsake, but I think it's more than that. It feels. She turned the tin in her lap. Beneath the fabric, at the very bottom, a strip of paper curled against the wood. Faded ink, no longer readable. She held it for a second, then put it back. "It was here when I came," she said, "under the roots. I thought about burning it, but I couldn't." Thomas watched her close the lid again. Not like closing a box, but like closing a chapter that hadn't been hers to write. A breeze moved through the trees. Dry, heavy with sap. The sound it made wasn't quite music. More like whispering with no breath behind it. "Do you think grief can live in wood?" she asked. Thomas didn't know, but he'd seen barns that remembered fire, chairs that creaked louder when someone sat with a broken heart. "Maybe it's not the wood," he said. "Maybe it's what people leave behind when they don't say goodbye." Ada nodded. "A slow thing." Her thumb brushed a groove in the tin. Not out of habit, almost as if she was giving it comfort. They sat there until the light changed. Shadows climbed the trees behind them, and the orchard darkened not all at once, but in slow retreat. Later, back inside, she placed the box on the shelf above the stove. Not hidden, but high enough it wouldn't be knocked. A quiet monument to something unnamed. She didn't speak of it again. But that night, when they ate stew by the fire, she touched his hand to pass the salt. And this time, she let it rest there a moment longer than she needed to. Autumn came with silence, not color. The trees held their leaves longer than usual, as if unwilling to let go. When they finally fell, it was in clumps, wet, heavy, and unspectacular. No blaze, no gold, just surrender. Ada began drying herbs beneath the eaves. Bundles of yarrow, mint, and goldenrod lined the rafters, casting a bitter scent into the air. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, her fingers stained green. Sometimes Thomas saw her pause, eyes closed, as if listening to something far away. He fixed the fence, patched the shed, built a new stool after the old one collapsed beneath her with a crack that startled the goats. They never spoke of the stool. He just carved a sturdier one and left it by the table. She sat on it the next day like it had always been there. In town, they went together now, not side by side, but not apart. People watched. Ada kept her chin high. Thomas kept one hand close to her back, not touching, just near. At the general store, a woman said under her breath, "Didn't expect him to take up with someone like that." Ada heard. So did Thomas. Neither replied. Later, on the road back, she said, "You ever think we still look like strangers to them?" He shrugged. "Let them look. They don't light our stove." Back home, she canned what was left of the harvest. Apples, beets, even the bitter plums. He brought her jars. She wiped them clean before storing. That's how they measured time now. Not in days, but in shelves filled. The first snow came early, thin and dry. It blew sideways, whispering across the porch like it was asking permission. Thomas was lighting the fire when Ada came to stand beside him, pressing her hands to the front of his coat. She didn't say anything, Didn't need to. A year had passed. No declarations, no ledger marks, just a fence that held, a fire that caught, and a woman who no longer pulled away. It snowed the morning they ran out of salt. Not a storm, not even a proper squall, just a hush, a kind of erasure, the kind of snow that made the world look unfinished. Ada stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass. Outside, flakes drifted sideways, catching in the porch rail, the goat fence, the creases of Thomas's coat as he brought in more wood. A full year! The thought came not as triumph, but as fact. Nothing had broken, nothing had run, and everything that had stayed, stayed by choice. She turned as he stepped inside, snow on his shoulders, face ruddy with cold. He shook it off at the door, set the wood near the stove, then looked up. "Store's too far to ride out and back before dark." Ada nodded. "We'll manage." He poured water into the kettle. She brought over a scrap of bread, the last of the root preserves. Nothing much, but it would hold them. They sat close as the fire worked itself alive. Thomas leaned back, eyes on the flames. "You still think of him?" "Sometimes," she said, "but now it feels like reading a name on a grave you don't visit." He nodded, didn't press. She turned the question. "And her?" "Only in dreams, and fewer now." Ada folded her hands in her lap. The silence stretched, but it didn't ache. It settled like warmth into wool. "I used to think grace was something soft," she said, "a gentle thing, a word in church. But maybe it's harder than that. Maybe it's surviving without bitterness." Thomas didn't answer, just reached for her hand and held it. No ceremony, no permission asked. She didn't pull away. Outside, the snow kept falling. Not heavy, not fast, but true. Thanks for listening. If this story meant something to you, if you saw a piece of yourself or someone you've known, drop a comment below. Let us know what stayed with you. Leave a like if it found its way under your skin. And hit subscribe. There's more coming. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that carry the most weight. Stay grounded, stay kind, and wherever you are, keep going.